All right. Hello, this is the February 9th online hangout for engineering ethics at NJIT. We're on lesson 4 right now. So we'll be going through lesson 4. Let me go ahead and pull that up on the screen. Not many people are in the chat right now. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave a comment in the chat here or in the open thread. I'll be looking at all of them throughout the hangout. So the lesson this week is on Dennis Joya. We're continuing our discussion of the Pinto case. Last week we introduced the case and we talked about it in the context of consequentialism, how you reason about the consequences. This week we're going to look at Dennis Joya. Dennis Joya was the field recall coordinator for Ford during the Pinto controversy. So he was the person who was, whose job it was to review outstanding cases of potentially dangerous vehicles and recall them if they were defective or dangerous in any way. Right, so it was his job to recall the Pinto, and he didn't. And he explains his decision-making process in this article, Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics. So this is the main reading for this week. This is from 1992. It's significantly after the Pinto controversy had sort of faded away. He had gone on to work in academia for a while. He now, I believe he teaches business ethics at Penn State, maybe the University of Pennsylvania. So he's basically teaching a class like this. So he gets to explain his decision-making process quite a lot. Oops, someone's trying to call me. 1 second. Are people in a different chat? I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. Looks like a bunch of the students tried to add from a different page, but we have students here, so I'm going to tell them to come there. Okay. Let's go back to where we are. Okay, so yeah, so Dennis Joya is talking about his decision-making in the Pinto case. So that's the main reading for this week. So think about Joya's decision-making. There's a little bit of discussion of workplace responsibilities in your textbook. The other big part of this week's lesson that I want to talk about in today's hangout is this stuff on psychology. So in the 50s and 60s, there were a bunch of psychology experiments about human susceptibility to conform to pressure, especially the pressure of authority figures. The two big experiments that came out of this era are the Asch conformity experiment and the Milgram experiment, and I wanted to go over those in some detail and talk a little bit about why people conform the way they do. There's some other discussion here. I believe the quiz this week is actually different from previous weeks. Oh, no. Sorry. Next week's is different from previous weeks, sorry. Okay. Students are trying to call me again, 1 second. Are there any questions before I get going? Here, let me turn the camera back on me. Are there any questions before we get going? I'm sorry. There's a bunch of students trying to call me from a different thread, so I've been dealing with them, trying to get them over here. Does anyone have any questions about the assignments for this week or even the assignments from the last few weeks? Comments or questions about the lessons or anything else? If you do, please throw your questions up in chat, and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Okay, let's go back into the lesson. Okay. So let's talk about Dennis Joya for a little bit. Let me show you a picture of Dennis Joya, so you know what this guy looks like. There he is. There he is. Nice big smile on his face. Yeah, he's at Penn State. He's in business ethics. Okay. I'm going to mute someone's mic. I'm not sure who's making the extra sounds. Okay. If you want to talk, though, just jump back on, but I'm going to mute your mic until then. Okay, so Joy is talking about his experiences at Ford. He starts the article talking about how he's basically a child of the 60s. He wore his hair long. He had a disdain for corporate America, profound distaste for the Vietnam War, and was a participant in the 60s countercultural movement. So it was kind of shocking when he went into an MBA program and when he became a business major, but he thought that he could have, so he says here, he would have a greater chance of influencing social change in business if he just worked behind the scenes on the inside rather than as a strident voice from the outside, right? So his idea was that he can go in and change the corporate culture from the inside. And he does it, and he quickly gets, instead of changing the corporate culture from the inside, he quickly gets caught up in the game, he says. And he explains for the first half of this article just how hard his job was and how much pressure he was under and how difficult it was to make the decisions that he was making. He says that very early on, the threats to the company were taken personally, and so it led to the strong we versus them, where we, the Ford members, needed to defend ourselves against them, all the outside parties and voices demanding that we change our ways. Right? So he wants to go in there to change their ways, but he immediately becomes a we, members of Ford, trying to defend Ford from the outside. Right? So he changed his perspective almost immediately. And this is this conformity thing. Then he explains some of his job requirements, in particular that his job was to look at the most critical safety recalls. And then he explains some of the Pinto case, and we already know a lot of this stuff from reading the other articles, right, that there was this strong 2,000 pound, $2,000 limit, and then the extra $11 part wouldn't have fit into the corporate culture of safety doesn't sell. And in particular, he talks about the Dowie piece that describes this controversial calculation where they did a cost-benefit analysis of changing the part, this $11 part, would have cost $137 million versus paying off all the injured people in lawsuits, which would have cost about $50 million. He says the cost-benefit decision was then construed as straightforward. No production fix would be undertaken. The philosophical and ethical implications of assigning a financial value to human life and disfigurement did not seem to be a major consideration in reaching this decision. He says some of this decision happened in 1970, and he doesn't get into the field recall coordinator position until 1973, where the Pinto had already been out on the road for a few years. Let me just check the comments to make sure everyone's okay. And so one of the things he talks about is how the corporate culture not only is dissuading people from checking into safety concerns, but it's actually changing the way that they think about these problems, right? So he says there were quite a number of safety problems that were under consideration as candidates for addition to the recall list. And he says actually the word problem was a word whose public use was forbidden by the legal office because it suggested because it suggested corporate admission of culpability. Condition was a sanctioned word, right? So right away he talks about how in the corporate environment they start changing your vocabulary to meet their vision of what their culture should be like, right? So you don't talk about problems, you talk about conditions, because conditions don't don't imply any kind of culpability. He also says the idea of component failure was another forbidden word that the recall coordinator wasn't encouraged to use. He was encouraged to use other words from these. And this is part of the process of shaping the decision-making process, shaping the way that you're thinking about these issues, right? Adopting the corporate culture, adopting the corporate speak. Many of you have probably had experiences talking with corporate people who use this kind of language habitually, talking it as if it was their mother tongue. Okay, so here he talks about actually getting the reports from field representatives of the Pintos lighting up. He says there are few reports. Component failure was not initially assumed. And then asks, so was there a problem? He says, well, not as far as I was concerned. My cue for labeling a case as a problem either required high frequency of occurrence or directly traceable causes. Right? So because this was low frequency of occurrence and they didn't know what the cause was, at least at first, they didn't speculate about potential problems that didn't fit the pattern for possible recall. He says, I do remember being disquieted by the field reports, accompanied by detailed photos of the remains of burned out Pintos in which several people had died. He says, although the report became part of my file, it did not flag it. It did not become a special case, right? It didn't stick out as something needing a recall. And then again, he talks about the incredible difficulty of the job, right? How hard it was to be Dennis Joya, thinking about all these cases. The overall complexity and pace of the job. He says, I distinctly remember that the information processing demands led me to confuse the facts of one problem case with another on several occasions because the telltale signs of recall candidate cases were all so similar. He says, I thought of myself as a fireman who perfectly fit the description of one of my colleagues. In this business, everything is a crisis. You only have time to put out the big fires and spit on the little ones. And by those standards, the Pinto was a distinctly little problem. And then here again with the conformity, he says, it's important to convey the muting of my emotions as the field recall coordinator. He remembers contemplating that his job was literally involving life or death matters. He says he took it very seriously. He says early on in the job, I woke up at night wondering whether I'd covered all the bases, right? So he's saying that sometimes his job actually interrupted his sleep. Was there a comment from someone? I can stop here if someone wants to interject. Okay, I'm going back. He says, so early on in the job, he was waking up at night, worried that he hadn't done everything that he could. But he says that soon faded, and of necessity, the consideration of people's lives became fairly removed, a dispassionate process. To do the job well, there was little room for emotion. Allowing it to surface was potentially paralyzing and prevented rational decisions about which cases to recommend for recall. On moral grounds, I knew I could recommend most of the vehicles on my safety tracking list for recall. On practical grounds, though, I recognized that the people implicitly accept risk in their cars. We could not recall all cars with potential problems and stay in business. I learned to be responsive to those cases that suggested an immediate dangerous problem. And he says, oh, by the way, we were also in an oil crisis at the time. Ford was in a bunch of business trouble with these small Maverick cars dealing with the crisis. Ford wanted to get in on this compact economy car business. Right, so financial pressure, personal pressure, how he had to mute his emotions, right, changing his own attitudes, changing the language that he uses, right. This is all part of what gets him to conform to the corporate culture, to the expectations that the CEO and other managers have for this job, right. Right, he's thinking in terms of not ethics, right? He says, if I was thinking ethically, then I could recall most of these cars. But instead, he was thinking practically, and practically in terms of what makes sense for Ford to stay in business. And on his estimation, what made sense for Ford to stay in business was to allow a lot of cars that he knew to be unsafe to still be on the road because they didn't meet the kind of conditions that he was required to meet by the job. So basically, Joya just fits the job description, right? He does what his corporate overlords demanded of him, and he did it at his own personal discomfort, right? It went against his own personal idea of ethics. It went against his own emotional responses, right? He had to suppress these responses in order to maintain this job. Especially in a highly competitive job where there's a lot of people, looking for promotions, right? Doing this kind of job well, following the corporate orders well, is what gets you those promotions, right? So he thought he was doing a good job. He thought he was doing his job well. He says, Pinto reports kept trickling in, but at a slow rate that didn't at first get his attention. He does remember seeing some of these pictures of crashes. And as a result of these pictures, he did recommend the Pinto for a departmental level review, where there's a meeting and they all go around talking about whether in fact they should recall. And at this meeting, he says everyone voted against recommending the recall, including me. He says it did not fit the patterns of recallable standards. The evidence was not overwhelming that the car was defective in some way. So the case was actually fairly straightforward. It was a good business decision, even if the people might be dying. When the crash test, so he's saying all this not knowing about the crash test results that were run pre-production and that the company did know about, but the Ford recall coordinator didn't know about it. So because he didn't know about the crash test results, he didn't realize that this could be a recallable problem, that it was a defective part. But as the data started coming in and they realized that it might actually be a defective part, they compared the Pinto to other competitor small cars, and they said, although the Pinto performed poorly, it was merely the worst of the bad lot. Most of the other cars were also performing poorly. So the idea was that this is just what it took to for a subcompact, economy car to sell in this climate, in this economic climate. He says over here, I implicitly acknowledge that all these cars are people accept an implicit risk in all these cars. Let me check comments. Okay, so he doesn't issue a recall. He eventually leaves Ford, and in fact, he leaves Ford in 1975, right before the Dowie article gets published in 1977, where Ford gets in trouble through this expose. A jury in 1978, because of this expose, there was a federal investigation into the process. In 1978, the jury awarded burn victims $125 million in punitive damages, way more than Ford was expecting to pay. Right? Ford was expecting to pay maybe $50 million, so 1.5 times that amount. But this was the initial offer, and it was later reduced upon appeal to $6.6 million. So for killing maybe 20 people or so, causing a bunch of unsafe cars to be on the road, that cost Ford about $6 million. Notice that this $6 million is significantly less than the $50 million that they were anticipating having to spend. So after these court decisions, it actually seems like Ford did make the right business decision. Another way to say it is that Ford got away with releasing these unsafe cars. Right? This is for a huge company like Ford, $6 million is nothing. It's a slap on the wrist. These cases all came to a head in this one case where these 3 teenage girls died. But Ford put together a great legal team to defend itself. Yeah, this was the first time that any corporation was tried for criminal behavior. It was tried for negligence, homicidal negligence, reckless homicide. Killed these people. But Ford didn't lose this battle. In fact, Ford won this battle. They had their legal team won this battle, so they weren't held accountable for reckless homicide in this case. Shortly after this case, though, in 1980, is when Ford ceased production of the Pinto. Okay. So that's everything about Joya's life through the decision-making process and through the end of the Ford controversy. Joya's going to go on to explain why he made this decision the way he did, and he's going to put it in terms of what he calls corporate scripts. In fact, what he does after he leaves Ford is he goes to Penn State and he does research, psychological research. Well, maybe, I don't know if he was at Penn State when he did this research, but he did some psychological research, published some papers on script following. So a script, it's a psychological term. A script is any sort of behavioral routine that we follow. So an easy example of a script is the back and forth exchange that you have with the cashier at a fast food restaurant. Right, so everyone knows how that exchange is supposed to go, right? They ask, can I take your order? And you go up there and you give them your order. And there's this back and forth, and the dynamics of that script is clear to everyone. If you deviate from that script, things get weird, right? So if you go up to your cashier and start asking them about how their day was or what they plan on doing this weekend, right? If you don't know that person, asking these kinds of questions is weird. It's maybe even creepy. Because it deviates from the script, right? There's this accepted dialogue, this accepted sort of routine, sort of like a dance, a language dance, between the participants. And in order for this exchange, in order for this social exchange to happen, everyone needs to be following the script so that it happens according to everyone's expectations, right? This is what allows us to interact with people that we don't know, that we have no idea who they are, but we know the context, and we have scripts for managing that context that allow us to interact with anyone. So scripts aren't a bad thing. Scripts are a deep part of how psychology, our own psychology works. As social creatures, we have to follow scripts, especially to navigate complex social environments like we do. And this is Joya's explanation of why he made the decisions that he did. Let me find the. Yeah, so he says, my central thesis is that my own schematized scripted knowledge influenced me to perceive recall issues in terms of the prevailing decision environment and to unconsciously overlook key features of the Pinto case, mainly because they did not fit with an existing script. While the outcomes of the case carry retrospectively obvious ethical overtones, the schema's driving my perceptions and actions precluded consideration of these issues in ethical terms because the scripts did not include ethical dimensions. Right, so then he goes on to explain scripts. Right, scripts are these cognitive schemas that allow you to retain specialized knowledge and specific actions appropriate to a situation. Right, this is how we structure knowledge. And his claim is that in the corporate environment of Ford, they structure his knowledge so that when he's looking at these Pinto cases, he's evaluating them in terms that his job demands of him, that the corporation demands of him. Right, so he's treating this decision environment not sort of personally on his own ideas of what good decisions are or on his own ethical views, but rather he's treating them on the scripted ethical views given to him by the corporate environment. Right, so this is what informs his decision-making process. This is what leads him to make the decisions that he does. Even though they're against his own moral disposition. Right, so he recognizes the ethical problems, especially after the fact, but in the moment he wasn't able to see these problems because the scripts that he was following did not include ethical dimensions. He starts this section, by the way, talking about how, maybe he's just trying to excuse his own decision-making process. Maybe he's actually just a traitor to his own values. He talks about going into his classes and having his students call him a traitor, call him reprehensible for making the decisions that he does. He talks about other possible explanations. Maybe the corporate culture reduced his ethical perspective. And his claim here is that it's not that Ford made him less ethical, it just made him make decisions in this environment that weren't ethical, right? So he still had the same ethics, he wants to say, but he was following scripts that didn't reflect these ethics, and this was the problem. Yeah. His MBA students calling him a moral failure, saying that he's doubly reprehensible because he was in a position where he could make a difference. Poor Dennis Joya, being abused by his students. Let me go ahead and stop here and see if anyone has questions or comments. Thoughts, comments? Anyone? Groupthink is powerful. That is correct. We'll talk about how powerful in a few minutes when we go through the Milgram experiments, the conformity experiment. And it's hard to break from it, that's right. The last few weeks we've been talking about ethics, and one of the common themes that's come up in a lot of the discussions is that human beings are selfish. A lot of people have said repeatedly that human beings are motivated by selfish purposes, that they mostly think about themselves. A lot of this came in response to the Wallace video, This is Water, talking about the default perspective, where the default perspective is supposed to be self-interested, selfish. I actually personally think that this is wrong, that human beings aren't selfish, fundamentally. What they are is conformers, fundamentally, that they'll adapt to whatever the social situation is and try to make the best of it, try to use whatever social power they can access. And sometimes this is for selfish reasons, but sometimes it's radically against selfish reasons. Right? So Dennis Joya is supposed to be an example of this case, where he himself had values that went radically against his choices, but nevertheless he felt pressured to follow those choices because of the social pressure. Right? So it wasn't a selfish reason, it wasn't a selfish motivation. He wasn't doing it out of his own interests. He was doing it out of the corporate interests that he sort of just adopted without critically thinking about it, without reflection. And it wasn't until after the fact, much later, that he realizes, oh, well, I made a bunch of unethical decisions, and I should have done differently, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. So this is one of the challenges in these engineering ethics classes. Students come into the class thinking that a lot of this stuff is common sense. I know the difference between right and wrong. You just choose the right things, and figuring out what the right thing is pretty easy. Maybe in trolley cases where things are weird, it gets difficult, but in general cases, people think that they know what the difference between right and wrong is, and they can make the correct decisions. And part of the trouble here is that this is wrong, that we overestimate our own powers of deciding for ourselves. In fact, most of the decisions that we make are made because of these very strong social pressures to conform to expectations that are set by the environment, and we have relatively little power in bucking that pressure. If this is the case, then human beings aren't mostly selfish, they're mostly social. And by social, I mean that they conform to the social expectations. Just to say, this is one of the reasons why I have everyone talk to each other online, because you're going to learn a lot more from the social pressure that you are all putting on yourselves than you will from any social pressure that I can put on you. So it's a little teacher's trick. Any comments or questions, thoughts, contributions? Okay, so I can keep going through the Dennis Joya article, but I want to. Yeah. Okay. So Mina says, I think it's really easy to judge Joya, but I believe many of us would have made the same decision in the same circumstances. I think that's exactly right. And I mean, this again tells you the difficulty of engineering ethics, of being ethical, especially in a corporate environment, especially when there's not just corporate pressure, not just pressure from your managers and bosses, but also economic pressure. Right? You need this job to survive. If you don't have this job, you can't feed your family. Right? All this kind of pressure makes it very attractive to conform to these kind of pressures. It makes it very easy to decide in this way. I mean, it says day in, day out, we all make decisions at work we're not happy with, or do not agree with, but we have to do it to keep the job. That's right, right? And part of the lesson here, I think, is that it's not just a matter of knowing what's right and knowing what's wrong, because that's not the difficult part. The difficult part is knowing which decisions you can live with and which ones you can't, and that's a different kind of question. It requires having a much better sense of what your values are, who you are as a person, what values you want to defend. And one of the things about talking about scripts in the way that Joya does is that he sort of gives up his own individual identity, right? It's not him making those decisions, it's Ford acting through him, and he's just sort of an automaton for Ford, right? And this is one of the dangers, is that we can sort of get swept up as an automaton in these positions. So let me go ahead and move to, I've got a bunch of YouTube videos that I want to show. So let me go ahead and show some of these. Okay. Okay, so did everyone see that video? Was that playing through? Yeah. Yeah. So hopefully that video came through. That was an old Candid camera. Right. So everyone knows how to use a elevator. No one uses elevators in this way, but even minor social pressure, even from complete strangers, can get the person to conform. Right. You'd rather be like everyone else than stick out and not do like everyone else, because if you stick out, then you might get called out for it and you might get in trouble. So better to conform. Notice that none of these people are doing this really for selfish reasons. They're doing it for social reasons. There's a social pressure. They're not thinking about themselves except that they don't want to stick out and be different from everyone else. So that was to be a sort of fun little introduction, but this has deeper psychological implications. So, like I said, in the 50s and 60s, there were a series of psychological experiments. And the first big set of experiments was the Asch conformity experiments. In the Asch conformity experiments, they asked people, so they showed people a line, and they asked people to identify the other line of these three that matches the first line in size. So obviously the answer is C here. But the way that they did this was in groups where everyone but one person was a confederate of the experiment. Right? So only one person was the actual subject, and everyone else was working with the experiment to test that one person. And the question was whether that person conforms with the group when they make incorrect answers or not. So I'm going to go ahead and play this next video. I'm going to do it here. Sorry. No. Why are you not? Search, add. All right, that was pretty great. Fashion in the 70s was pretty great. So notice, in the original Ash experiment, something like 30% of people, ended up conforming, 35%. And then notice that this goes up or down depending on the social circumstances. So if you have someone who's agreeing with you in the group, even if you're a minority, as long as you have another confederate, someone who's on your side, then you're much more likely to reject the group and assert your own self, right? So if you have a partner, someone who is working with you, then you're more confident in your own assessment. But if you're completely outweighed by the group, you tend to conform, or at least a third of people tend to conform, and they do it for different reasons. It's not all the same reasons. Sometimes they doubt their own perception, right? So sometimes it's a self-doubt, but sometimes it's not self-doubt. They know that they're right, but they still want to conform because they don't want to make social waves, right? So this is a different kind of social pressure. It's not causing self-doubt, but it's causing conformity for other reasons. So people have lots of reasons why they do this. It's not that people are all acting sort of robotically here. But nevertheless, it's this reliable effect that people tend to conform, especially as the group pressure becomes more overwhelming, more unanimous. Notice that when there is no threat of group pressure, right, when you're answering the questions on paper, then you don't have the same pressure to conform. So it's really about having people watch you. The fact that you know that people are watching you changes the way that you behave. People know this. If you put a picture of eyes, or someone with eyes, someone with a face, near like a buffet, a food buffet, people will take less food. They'll also tend to take healthier food if they think they're being watched. People act differently when they think that someone is watching them. The best example of this is the panopticon. Panopticon was a prison design in the 1800s. The prison design was this giant circle. And the idea was that instead of having long rows of prison cells, you had a circular prison with a central guard tower so that you could look inside all of the cells at the same time. So that way everyone knew that they were being watched at all times. Right? If it was just a long dark hallway, then you're not being watched until the guard walks past you. But in this place, you're being watched at all times. And in fact, this is so effective at watching people that you don't even really need to staff the guardhouse in the center with a person. Just the idea that they could be watched at any one point is enough to change their behavior. Right? Part of the point of this kind of surveillance as control is that when I know I'm being watched, I'll change my own behavior. So that way you don't have to change my behavior. I'm doing all the enforcing work myself. Right? So no one has to force Joya to make that decision. Right? Joya forces himself to make that decision because he's adopted the script, because he's submitted to the authority in that corporate environment. Thoughts, comments? I want to talk about the Milgram experiment also. Yeah, the panopticon is pretty depressing. That is correct. Total surveillance. I mean, the panopticon is depressing. It's even more depressing to see how many video cameras are everywhere all the time. Right, the point of those video cameras is also the same. Usually for most of these video cameras, there's not a security guard watching it at the time. If anyone watches it, it's later to, the police might look at it later after a crime is committed or to collect insurance or something. But no one's actually watching those video cameras most of the time. Nevertheless, just the mere fact that they're there can get people to change their behavior. This is conformity at large-scale social levels. Good job, America. All right, so let's go ahead and keep pushing on. I want to. So the Ash conformity experiment is suggestive. It's interesting, but the big powerhouse experiment from the 60s was the Milgram experiment by Stanley Milgram at Yale University. So let me explain how the Milgram experiment works, and then I want to actually show you instances of people doing the Milgram experiment. I think this Ash conformity experiment is actually a reconstruction, like a dramatic reconstruction. But this Milgram experiment, you'll see the actual people doing this experiment. This is a famous experiment. It's well-known in psychology. If you've ever taken a psychology class, you probably talked about it. But a lot of people don't know about this experiment, and I think it's really important to talk about. Your book also does mention it, your textbook, so you can see some more discussion in there. So here's the setup of the experiment. This is the electric shock experiment. The setup of the experiment has so there's a experimenter, E, there's the teacher, T, and there's the learner, L. The experimenter and the learner are both confederates of the experiment. They're part of the experiment. The person who's being tested is the teacher, but they don't know that they're being tested. In fact, the teacher thinks that their job is to test the learner. So the story that they tell both the teacher and the learner at the same time, the experimenter tells both the teacher and the learner at the same time. And I'll just show you a little bit. I'll play this in the background. Maybe you can see that, yeah. So here's the experimenter telling both the teacher and the learner about how the experiment works. And what the experiment says is that the teacher is supposed to teach the learner a memory. It's supposed to be a memory test. And the idea is to see how well the learner learns through punishment responses. So the idea is that the teacher is supposed to list some words to the learner. The learner is supposed to memorize those words and then list them back to the teacher. And if the learner gets it right, then the teacher goes on to the next word. But if the learner gets it wrong, then the teacher is supposed to administer an electric shock. And the electric shocks start off fairly weak, 100 volts, and they go up to something like 450 volts. And you're supposed to increase the voltage every time the learner gets something wrong. Now, initially in the experimenter tells them to choose the paper, one to be the learner and one to be the teacher. But this is just rigged because the learner is a confederate of the experiment. Is actually working with the experiment. So it's really the teacher who finds out they're going to be a teacher. But the teacher here thinks that they could have been a learner, so they don't know that they were supposed to be the teacher. So after they get their assignments, they come over here and they look at, so here's the panel that the teacher is going to be using to administer the shocks. Oops, come back over here. Yeah, here's the panel from 50 volts, 130 volts, strong shock, very strong shock, all the way up to intense shock, and then extreme intensity shock, 300 volts, danger, severe shock, and then triple X at 450 volts. So after this, they take the learner into the room, and the learner, so they bring the teacher in to watch as the experimenter explains what's going to happen. And one of the things that happens here is that the learner tells the experimenter that he has a heart condition, that he has a bad heart, that his doctor said to not undergo any strenuous activity because it might be bad for his heart. He asked the experimenter, will these electric shocks hurt my heart condition? Will they make my heart condition bad? And the experimenter says, no, you should be safe. The electric shocks might feel painful, but they won't actually hurt you. And so the learner says, okay, that's fine. Was there a comment, a question? Someone have a comment? Okay, I'm gonna mute your mic then. Sorry, I guess. Okay, good. Okay, so the experimenter explains to the learner that they're gonna get shocked, and then here's the learner sitting here getting explanation. So now I want to actually watch some of these. I want to watch two people, and then we'll talk a little bit about the experiment. So. Okay, so the first person we're going to watch is going to reject the demands, right? So the experimenter is going to keep prodding the teacher to keep administering the shocks, and the first person we're going to watch is going to refuse. Is going to start doing it for a little bit and then is going to refuse, and then we'll watch someone who actually goes through with it all the way to the very end. Yes. Well, so the claim is that they're learning by punishment. And in fact, they're not actually learning by punishment. The actual experiment is to see how far the teacher's willing to go in administering these shocks to the learner. There's no actual shocks being administered. I think this might be one of the questions on the test. Right? No one's actually getting shocked, but the teacher thinks that they're shocking someone. And so the question is, how far is the teacher willing to go in administering these shocks? And we'll see two cases of this. We'll see one person who stops and then another person who goes all the way. All right. Yeah, so just to pause it there. So this guy and the guy before him rejects the assignment. Or he's told to keep going with the shocks, and he says no. He refuses. He laughs a little bit, but he eventually. Um, uh, and you see, they get pretty agitated at this. They get upset. They get angry. This is one of the reasons why people don't perform the Milgram experiment anymore, because it's really hard on the teachers. Emotionally hard. It's traumatizing in some senses, and that's what happens with this next guy. So this guy always makes my heart break when we watch him. But this guy's going to go through with it, and I want to watch him for a few minutes. Um, Oh, my heart always breaks at that scene where he turns around and says, who's going to take the responsibility for this? And the experimenter says, I'll take the responsibility for this. And he turns around completely defeated, right? He knows he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing. He knows he's doing something that goes against his own values, but he's doing it anyway because this authority figure is telling him to do it. So this guy, he keeps saying no, he doesn't want to do it, but he does it anyway because the authority figure demands it of him. And he will eventually go all the way up to 450 volts. In fact, before the very end of the shock treatment, about halfway through, the learner stops responding at all. So he's complaining a lot. He's screaming out that it's hurting. He can't take it anymore. And then he just stops responding. And the teacher doesn't know if he's dead, if he's passed out, doesn't know what's going on. But they're asked to keep administering the shocks. And that guy continues all the way to the end. In fact, Milgram finds that the original Milgram experiments, which have been confirmed since, found that 65% of participants, 26 out of 40 people, administered the final massive 450 volt shock. 65% of people. This is much higher than the conformity experiments. But notice there's a bit, the Ash conformity experiments, but notice there's a big difference in Ash's conformity experiments versus these obedience experiments, and that's with the authority figures. With Ash's conformity experiments, you're just listening to the group, and none of them are experts or none of them are authority figures. There's just a whole lot of them. But in this case, it has a lot to do with the authority figure themselves. The fact that they're a Yale scientist in a lab coat looks very professional. They're at a major research institution. All of this stuff makes it seem a lot more credible and makes people a lot more willing to go along with it. There's been a lot of variations of this experiment, and if you change up the experimenter, if the experimenter is not associated with a major institution, if the experimenter doesn't look like a researcher, if they're dressed in board shorts and they look like they just got out of a pool or something, if they don't look like they're a real experimenter, then people are not willing to follow along. If there's multiple experimenters and they disagree with themselves, where one person keeps pushing the person on to keep administering the shocks, and the other person is like, no, maybe you should stop. Right? If there's any disagreement among the authority figures, then people are much less willing to obey. Brent says in the comments, once he realizes that it's not on him, I feel as if the teacher doesn't feel responsible for it. He doesn't feel responsible. He recognizes that someone else is taking responsibility, but it seems like he still feels responsible in the sense that his emotional. He's agitated, right? He's rubbing his head in his hand. And if you keep watching this video, I recommend that you keep watching the video. He goes on like this for another 15 minutes, or 10 minutes, in a lot of panic. At the very end of the experiment, they bring the learner out and they tell the guy that nothing was actually wrong and it was a big hoax. And you can tell that he's just completely grateful that it looks like his stomach sank. It looks like he's deeply concerned about what he's doing. This is why they don't run this experiment anymore, because it traumatizes people. One other thing to mention here. So the experimenter was given a script to follow, and the script for prodding the teacher on to keep going with the shocks. At the beginning, when the teacher first refuses, the experimenter was supposed to say, please continue, and then the experiment requires that you continue. And then it's absolutely essential that you continue, and finally, you have no other choice, you must go on. And this is really important in Milgram's original experiment and in the subsequent testings of this. You could get people to keep going on if you told them that they must go on, that it's a requirement that they go on. But as soon as you told people that they had no choice, that's when they refused. So 65% of the people went through with the full 450 volt shock, but everyone who stopped stopped right after this claim. When they said you have no choice, you must go on, that's exactly when people refused to go on and made a choice other than what they were being assigned. I think this is really important too. When you tell people that they don't have a choice, that's when they make a choice. That's when they assert their own choice. Yeah, someone in the chat is talking about drone pilots and PTSD experience, and that's definitely the case. In fact, Milgram was originally motivated to do this experiment as a result of reading about war criminals. So Adolf Eichmann was one of the architects for the Holocaust. And he was famously tried in Jerusalem in the 60s, around the time when Milgram was doing this experiment. And Eichmann pleaded with what came to be known as the Nuremberg defense, which a lot of Nazi high-ranking officials did, where they said, look, it wasn't my fault, I was just following orders. You can't blame me for what I did. It's not my responsibility. It's the responsibility of the person assigning the orders, and that wasn't me. I was just carrying them out. You can't hold me responsible, right? So, and we saw the same thing in the Milgram experiment, where the guy, looks over his shoulder and says, well, who's going to take responsibility? If you're going to take responsibility, then I'll go ahead and go through with it. As long as I'm not responsible, then I'll go through with it. This is the way that people think. Famously, the Nuremberg defense doesn't stand up. It's not considered legitimate. Soldiers, even in war situations, are responsible for the decisions they make. And if they make a decision to massacre a village of people, women and children, even if it's on orders from their commanding officer, they're responsible for carrying those orders out. Or they can be responsible for war crimes for doing it, even if they're given direct orders. In other words, it falls on the soldiers' shoulders to assess a situation by their own ethical lights and not just blindly follow orders. Someone in the chat made a reference to that this is water, the Wallace's discussion of default settings, that it's much easier to just do what you're told than to stop and analyze what you're doing. And that's exactly right. It's very easy to just follow the authority figure. And when you're in a business, especially in the corporate environment, there will always be plenty of authority figures to tell you what to do. And the question is, do you just follow what they say blindly, or do you actually think about what you're doing? And thinking about what you're doing is hard. It's not easy. In fact, everything about your psychological disposition weighs against it. We are strongly disposed to following. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts? It is easy to follow. So I guess the last thing I want to say is that following is important. And I'm going to actually make the word of the day follower. If you put follower in the online form, you will get credit for today's word. Today's word is follower. I want to close here by emphasizing how important it is that we can follow, right? So it's very easy to say that conformity is bad, especially when it makes people make bad decisions, like perhaps Dennis Joya made. But conformity is also absolutely vital. It's absolutely crucial for organizing human social situations. Right? We can have complex organizations at all because of our capacity to conform. Let me throw this link up really quickly. The thing I wanted to end on is one last little video. It's 3 minutes long, and then I'll let you all go. Yay! Yay! Uh, Thank you. I think that's everything I wanted to say. If as long as there's no questions, uh, make sure you sign in on the sign-in sheet with today's word of the day. And I will see you all next week. Good luck on your assignments. Thank you very much.